Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the daily Rambam Shiur, 3 chapters per day, lesson 198 and 199 from the 12th chapter until the 17th chapter of Hilchos Tum'at. In Parashas Chukas, which is the source of Hilchos Tum'at, our sages teaching us regarding the Pasuk Odom Kiyomus Ohel, and they are teaching Ein divrei Torah miskaimim elo b'mi shemei misatzmo alehem. The words of Torah cannot have a permanent stay only by someone who actually mei misatzmoi. He is willing to die. He puts the effort in cost of his own soul in order to obtain the words of Torah. So if in any words of Torah those promise is being given, how much more so in those Torah words which are related to Hilchos Oholim. In fact, about Yaakov Avinu, it says about him, Yoshev Oholim. If someone who involves in Torah is called a Yoshev Ohel. In our case, and these days, we are Yoshvim, we are trying to dwell, to learn and to understand those halachos which are related to Hilchos Oholim in connection to Tum'at. In fact, in the Talmud, the halachos of Negoim ve'Oholos are a reference to the complexity of halachos in relation to more simple halachos. So these are the hilchos of Ohel in Tum'at. So as we have mentioned in the previous shiurim, that a person can become tomei in Tum'at via three things: or by a direct contact, or by carrying, shaking, or moving, or via a tume of a ohel. The word ohel is being translated loosely a tent. Typically, when we say tent, we always imagining those type of tent which are appearing in the flyers of Home Depot or any other type of a promotional camping materials. However, when it comes to the term ohel, tent, in relation to halachos of Tum'ah v'Tahara, all what is necessary to obtain the definition of a tent is a material, a qualified material, which is as large of 1 square tefach, who happen to be positioned in a minimum height from a surface, from the ground, of 1 tefach. At the moment that a material of such a tefach is acquired, so if under this so-called tent, or not so-called, it is a ohel, tent in relation of Tum'ah v'Tahara, if under this tent there is a small piece in a size of a kezais, of a flesh, of a dead corpse, though it is not touching all the items that are next to him, since he and the other items who are next to him, though they are not touching each other, but they happen to be covered under the same roof, under the same tent, so the tumah is being transmitted to them as well. Not necessarily only to kelim, but as we have mentioned, even a human being will be catching tumah via him and other humans or utensils happen to be sharing space under the same tent. The same way where a piece of material can serve as a tent in order to transmit the Tum'at from one Tome item that is underneath the tent to other items which happens to be under the tent as well, the same way it will block and it will separate any access of Tum'at to anything that is above the tent. So let's imagine above this piece of cloth or material, there is a cup, and below this piece of material, there is a kazais of a flesh of a corpse and other cups. So these cups which are underneath the Ohel, they will be Tomei. The cup that is above the Ohel will be Tohir, because there is a dual function to the tent. A function of connecting anything that is underneath the tent, and a second function separating between whatever is underneath the tent to anything that is above the tent. However, in order to achieve this type of properties of the tent, needs to be a few requirements. First of all, it needs to be a height between the ground and the tent of at least a tefach. If no tefach has been achieved, so the tum'at that is underneath the tent will be called a tum'at retzutzo, a broken tum'at, since it has no room to breathe off of tefach, and therefore the rule is that it will be mevaka'as ve'oilo, ascending and being elevated directly above the point of the tum'at, and anything aside it won't be affected, and in such a case the entire so-called Ohel will be useless. There is another requirement, that the Ohel will be actually serving all the functions of Ohel, that it must be in such a material which are not defined as a perfect vessel and not defined as human. At the moment that the Ohel is being made or out of vessels or out of a human involvement, whether the involvement is directly that he becomes the Ohel, he becomes the supporter of Ohel, like for example the Rambam is using when there are 4 people who are being served as pillar, where a Ohel is on top of them. So in such a case, the Ohel will be effective in order to spread the tum'at underneath the Ohel, but it's not going to be effective to separate the tum'at from between whatever is underneath the Ohel and whatever is the above the Ohel. And for that reason, anything that is above the Ohel, in case that the material is not qualified material, will be Tomei. There is one exception, a new oven that were not used, though you may think that this is a kli, and for that reason it should not be able to serve as a separator, but since it is a new oven and it was never used, it will qualify to be a perfect Ohel. For example, if there is a tent on top of a new oven, so anything, any type of tum'at which is underneath this particular ohel will be able to be transformed to anything that is underneath the ohel, and yet anything that is above the board will remain tohil. When there is a beam which are connecting between one wall to another wall, and there is a sufficient size to the beam, which is a tefach, and underneath the beam there is an item which is a tomei mace, for example, a kezais of a mess. So all the utensils which will be under the beam will be tomei with the tumas ohel. Though in certain areas of the beam there is no sufficient size of a tefach, nevertheless, since a significant part possesses the size of a tefach, it will be strong enough to transfer the tumah throughout the entire beam. If the beam happens to be round beam, so the circumference must be at least 3 tefachim, according to the ruling that any size where the square will take a measurement of a tefach in order to achieve in a circumference of 3 times the size that what is necessary for it to be. If a beam is actually laying directly on the floor, so in order to apply this tumas oiholim will be required of 4.5 tefachim, given the fact that if I will make a theoretical, imaginary tefach of this round beam, I'll need to elevate about a tefach and a half in order to reach that point that will be the implied ohel. In the next chapter, the Rambam deals the different materials which are necessary to create a ohel to transfer the tumah to whatever is underneath the ohel and to serve as a separator to anything that is above the ohel. Since any type of ohel, whether it was done on its own through water or through salt, or whether a person have actually built it, must be to that should be a strong and a healthy type of a ohel, of a tent. If this tent is shaky, so biblically it cannot really transfer the tumah to whatever is underneath the ohel and cannot use as a separator. However, midirabonon, rabbinically, it will be able to transmit the tumah, but cannot serve as a separator. Example, branch of a tree. If they are strong enough in order to carry a layer of a building brick, will be considered a sufficient material to be served as a ohel. Another type of items that they are able to transmit the tumah and they are able to separate between the tumah. anything that is made of clay glolim or clay eitz haboim bemido, type of great utensils which are made not to be moved, rocks, or food which did not came with any contacts with water, so they are not muksho to be like a mekabel tumo. So they are the proper material who can serve as perfect oiholim, both to transmit the tumo to anything that is underneath them and to separate the tumo between whatever is underneath them and to whatever is above them. On the other hand, odom, human, or food which are tomei, they are able to bring the tumo, to transmit the tumo, but not to be served as separator. There are things that they are not able to bring and not able to separate. For example, vegetables, snow, ice, since they are totally not permanent whatsoever. On the other hand, there are a type of materials who are able to use as separators but not transmitters. For example, baskets made out of a net that are separating between two windows, that there is tumo in one window, in one house, so this particular net will be able to prevent the tumo to enter to the other house. In the third chapter, we are dealing with an issue which is called the tefach. The same way as tefach was a key word in order to determine the measurement that is necessary for ohel, and in connection of the ohel both as a transmitter and as a separator, the measurement of tefach happens to be also the size of a entry which will be able to transmit tumo from one domain to the other between two houses. So, for example, if there are windows or entries or opening between one house and to the other house, so if there is a room of tefach or more, this opening will lead the transmission of the tumo from one house to the other. However, there are two types of windows. There are windows which were built for functionality. It's called haloin hoasuyo letashmish. Such a case, a tefach will be the measurement that is necessary to transmit the tume from one domain to the other. Then there is another type of haloin, a window that were made for the only purpose of light. If the haloin was made for a light, even in a size of a coin, which is called pudyoin, will be enough to transmit the tume from one domain to another domain. And if the window was done on its own by natural forces or via water or via salt, in order to create a sufficient room to transmit the tume from one domain to another, will be necessary a size of a fist. Sometimes in a window that was made on its own by natural forces or via water or via salt, though originally it was made on its own, but nevertheless, if a person had the intention to transfer this window, whether to a function of what we call tashmish or whether to a function of oiro, then the measurement will be determined to the purpose that he designated in his mind. Any type of a window that is exposed to the air, the assumption that it was done for lighting, and the measurement will be like a pudyin. If a person, for example, went ahead and built above the window that was originally exposed to the air a roof over it, so obviously at this point this area can be used only for a tashmish. At this point the necessary size, the necessary hole that will be able to transmit the tumor will turn at this point to a tefach. If a person build above it a ceiling that covers only half of this window, so the part that is underneath the ceiling will be used as a chaloin of tashmish and will require a tefach. The one that is still exposed to the sky will be sufficient, even a size of a pudyin, in order to transmit the tumor. Now we are moving to lesson 199. So the first chapter is dealing about the above mentioned size of a tefach or a pudyin, which is a sufficient size to transmit the tumor from one domain to the other. So this size as well can be stuffed in order to prevent movement from one domain to another. However, the stuffing material must be from proper materials in order to be effective. And the rule is the following: two principles must be achieved in order that the stuffing will be acceptable. First of all, it must be a permanent stuffing in a way that his mind is not going to have any consideration to move it ever in the future. B, that the materials itself that he is stuffing in order to prevent the tumor to be transmitted must be from items that they are not susceptible to get tumor and they are not tomei as well. If one of those two conditions are not being met, so the stuffing and the blocking, the filling is not effective. Example, if a person actually stuffed the hole with type of oichlin, food, that though they are not susceptible to tumor, but they are proper food, so the stuffing cannot be treated seriously, since most likely he will remove those food for personal consumption. If that particular food is rotten and on top of it, it is not susceptible to tumor, he can use it as stuffing, as blockage material, since his mind is not to remove it ever. If a person stuffed or blocked that type of a hole in a vessel that is susceptible to become tomei, it's not a real blockage. However, if he filled up this vessel, this container, with different types of rotten figs, so the question over here, should I treat the blockage as a blockage that was done with a utensils that is not an acceptable item to block the hole, or I should consider the fact that it was blocked with rotten figs that he is not going to move it. And the ruling is I must to assess whether those figs without the support of the vessel, will they be strong and sufficient enough to block the hole? If the answer is yes, so the blockage is a acceptable blockage, since I'm not really relying on the kli. However, if there have no independent force to achieve the blockage, and the only way they are capable to do so is only thanks to the kli, so in such a way, the blockage is not acceptable. Another interesting halacha is the ability where a person can reduce the size of this tefach with a object that is tomei but less than the kashir. For example, a person will take half of a zayis of a tmei mace, as we have learned, less than a kezayis is not tomei. He will use this object in order to reduce the hole into less than a tefach. Or he will use a bones, which in a size less than a se'iro, in order to block this hole. It will be an acceptable blockage as long as the purpose of the blockage of the tumor, that the tumor itself that is meant to be blocked, is not from the same material. For example, if in one house there is a tumor of a flesh of a mess, a person won't be able to block this tefach with less than a kezayis of a flesh, because this half a kezayis will sort of be mitztaref to the what he wants to block with. He will be able to block with a etzem less than a se'iro, a tumor that is of bosor, and the opposite, he will be able to block with bosor a tumor of atzomis. However, it must be from the blocking material, must be made from a different material from the actual tumor that he is meant to block. A person in under certain condition, he will be able to reduce the size with a kli cheres, as long as A, it is mos, it is disgusting, B, it is facing the outside. The reason, which means it's facing the outside, correct, that the back of the kli cheres is facing the tumor, and the reason is since kli cheres einay metamem igaboy elo mitoichoy. A kli cheres, a clay type of a vessel, is not susceptible to tumor from the external side, but only me aviroi, only from the air. The second chapter, which is the 15th chapter of this halachos, is dealing the effectiveness of Tumas Ohel, how active, how effective when there is in the house a skylight, and the tumor can be found or inside the house or inside or underneath the skylight. So when there is the tumor object is inside the house, the area of the skylight will be protected because it's being exposed to the heaven. When the tumor is underneath the skylight, the entire house will be pure. When part of the tumor is under the skylight and part of it is under the house, will be dependent what is the size of the skylight, whether it is less than tefach or more than tefach. There is a situation when a person will place his foot on top of the skylight and by doing so, he managed to darken the room and eliminate the skylight. In such a case, the entire house is be turning to a ohel, and the house will be tomei. The person himself who actually placed his foot on top of the skylight, sometimes he will be tomei, sometimes not, depends on the size of the skylight, whether it has less than a tefach, so the person will remain tohir since the tumor has no way to come out. On the other hand, if there is more than a poiteach tefach, the tumor will be able to affect him. There is a similar discussion in a house that has 2 floors and 2 skylights, one underneath the other, when I can view the entire house as one unit and one not. There is quite a discussion and application of the halacha, which we have mentioned a few times before, regarding tum'o retzutzo, a tum'o that has less than a tefach space between the actual tum'o and between the ohel that covers above the tum'o. For example, there is a house where the tum'o is under a vessel which is precisely under the skylight. Given the fact that the vessel rests right on top of the tumor, and as such, the tumor becomes a tumor retzutzo, and as such, the tumor is heading upwards in a straight line, and the straight line happened to be directly under the arubo, so the entire house will remain tohir, will remain pure, since the tumor goes directly through the arubo, through the skylight, outward. However, if the tumor was underneath the klicheres, and yet there is a space of a tefach or more between the tumor and the bottom of the klicheres, which is a sufficient amount of a perfect application of tumas ohel, and as such, the entire tumor is being spread all over the house, and the entire house will be tomei. So here is a perfect example where the heights and the distance between the ohel and the tumor will be affecting the definition of an entire house, whether it is tohir or whether it is tomei. In the last chapter, the Rambam deals regarding to zizim, which is a beam or pole that is projecting outside the house, outwards. And sometimes it can be all over the house, sometimes it can be in the doorpost. How far via the tumas ohel they can bring the tumor from there to the house, or as well, if there is a tumor in the house, will affect all items that happens to rest under those beams. So I want to wish to everybody lots of brocho and atzlocho, and thank you very much.